Be me, Sancher. Marketing consultant, working from home, married for 5 years, to husband Ryan, who was 32 and worked as financial analyst at a downtown office, had strong feminist beliefs about equal division of household labor, constantly posted about weaponized incompetence and mental load women carried, believed women did disproportionate housework even when both partners worked full-time jobs outside home. Ryan worked long hours at the office, leaving at 7:00 a.m. and returning around 7:00 p.m. most days during the week. I worked from home, managing client accounts and projects with a flexible schedule, allowing me to work around household tasks. I started feeling resentful that I was doing more housework than Ryan, despite both of us working full-time jobs. Would see dishes in the sink when he left for work in morning, laundry piling up, floors needing vacuuming throughout the week. Posted on feminist forums about husband who didn't do equal share of housework, leaving mental load of managing household. To me, got responses from other women relating to husbands who avoided housework or did bare minimum requiring constant management. One woman suggested creating explicit short chart, dividing all household tasks 50/50, so husband couldn't claim ignorance. Created detailed spreadsheet listing every household task from dishes to laundry to vacuuming with assigned responsibility for each, divided tasks exactly in half. Expecting Ryan to do his 50% without me having to remind or manage his chores, presented a spreadsheet to Ryan saying, I needed equal partnership in household labor, not just in earning income. He looked at the chart and said he worked 60 hours weekly at the office while I worked from home with a flexible schedule. I said hours didn't matter. We both worked full-time and household labor should be divided equally, regardless. He seemed frustrated, but agreed to try doing his assigned tasks on a spreadsheet. Said he'd do best with his schedule. First week he did maybe 30% of assigned tasks, leaving dishes in the sink for days, and laundry and hampering unfolded, confronted him about not doing his share. He said he'd been exhausted from work and would catch up on the weekend. Weekend came and he did some tasks, but still left several undone, saying he needed rest after an intense work week. I felt angry that he was prioritizing rest over household responsibilities he'd agreed to share equally. Posted in feminist groups about husbands not following through on agreed chore division, despite promising to do his share. One woman suggested withholding intimacy until he consistently completed his household responsibilities as agreed. She said men respond to consequences. If a comfortable life continues regardless of effort, they won't change behavior. This felt extreme. But I was desperate to get Ryan to understand that household labor equality wasn't optional. Had a serious conversation with Ryan, saying our intimacy life would be on hold until he consistently did his 50% of household tasks. He looked shocked and asked if I was seriously withholding sex to force him to do more housework. I said I was setting boundaries about what I needed to feel respected and valued as an equal partner in marriage. I couldn't be intimate with someone who left all the household labor mental load to me while claiming exhaustion. He was quiet for a long time, then said he needed to think about what this ultimatum meant for our marriage. Following weeks, Ryan did slightly more housework, but still wasn't consistently completing his half of tasks on spreadsheet. Would come home exhausted from work, do a couple of tasks, then collapse on the couch saying he was too tired for more. I'd point out tasks left undone. He'd say he'd do them tomorrow. But tomorrow would bring the same exhaustion and excuses. 2 months into withholding intimacy, the household was cleaner than before, but Ryan seemed increasingly distant and withdrawn. Would come home, do minimal required tasks from the list, eat dinner, mostly in silence, then go to bed early. When I try to talk about his day or have a conversation, he'd give short answers. Seeming emotionally checked out, started wondering if the ultimatum was working since housework wasn't improving much and marriage felt hollow and disconnected. 3 months into the ultimatum, Ryan came home and said he'd made a decision that would address household labor issues. Felt hopeful that he was finally going to commit to doing his equal share of tasks consistently. He said he'd hired a cleaning service to come twice weekly to handle most of the household tasks on the spreadsheet. That service would cost $400 monthly, but would eliminate the source of conflict destroying our marriage. I felt shocked and angry. Said point wasn't just getting chores done, but him doing equal share of labor. He said keeping the household clean was supposed to be the goal. If professional service achieved, that everyone benefited. I said I wanted partnership, where he did his share. Not where he paid someone else to avoid responsibility. He said he worked 60 hours weekly, contributing the vast majority of household income. Using some of that income to buy time made sense. That he was exhausted from work and paying professionals to handle tasks he didn't have energy for was a reasonable solution. I said this was exactly the kind of weaponized incompetence feminists wrote about. Men avoiding work by outsourcing. He said he wasn't avoiding work. He was trying to solve problems in a way that worked with his energy and schedule. That he'd try to do tasks but couldn't maintain it with his work hours. Hiring help was compromised, not avoided. I said unless he was doing physical labor himself, this didn't meet my need for equal partnership in the household. He looked at me for a long moment, then said he had something else to tell me about decisions he'd made. I pulled out an envelope from my briefcase and handed it to me. Inside were divorce papers he'd already filed. Felt shock and panic. This was completely opposite of what I'd expected when he said he'd made a decision. Asked what divorce papers meant. He said withholding intimacy for 3 months to force housework had shown him marriage wasn't working. That he'd been exhausted from 6 0-hour work weeks. But I'd equated his exhaustion to laziness and unwillingness to contribute. Said he'd hired someone to remove a source of conflict, but also filed for divorce because an ultimatum revealed fundamental incompatibility. I said I didn't want divorce. I just wanted equal partnership where he did his share of household labor. He said you wanted an exact equal division of physical tasks without considering that I work longer hours contributing most of my income. That you'd refuse to value financial contribution differently from household task completion, as if all contributions were identical, and you'd weaponized intimacy to force compliance with your specific vision of equality, rather than finding compromise. Started crying, saying I'd been trying to create fair partnership, not destroy our marriage with reasonable expectations. He said your expectations might be reasonable for some couples, but weren't accounting for our actual circumstances. That I worked from home with flexible schedule while he commuted and worked 60 hours at office weekly. You wanted me to do exactly 50% of household tasks, despite having significantly less time and energy available. When I couldn't maintain that standard despite trying, you punished me with an ultimatum about intimacy. I've spent 3 months feeling like a failure as a husband because I couldn't meet standards that didn't account for my schedule, and I realized I don't want marriage where I'm constantly falling short of expectations that don't consider my actual capacity. Said through tears that I hadn't considered his work schedule, had assumed equal work hours meant equal household availability. He said that's part of the problem. You'd made assumptions about equality without considering the actual context of our lives. That feminist framework, about 50/50 division, didn't account for different work schedules, commutes, or energy levels. You'd applied ideological principles without considering whether it fit our specific situation and circumstances, asked desperately what I could do now to fix this. Whether withdrawing the ultimatum would make him reconsider divorce? He said the ultimatum revealed a deeper issue, that you value ideological equality over practical compromise in marriage. That you'd rather have exact 50/50 task division than consider that my 60 hours of work plus commute might matter. And you'd been willing to destroy intimacy in marriage to enforce a standard you decided was the only acceptable arrangement. Maid starts Monday to handle housework. Divorce should be final in 6 months. I'm moving out this weekend. This conversation ended any hope that he'd been planning a positive solution. He'd been planning exit from marriage, posted on feminist forums about husbands who'd hired a maid and filed for divorce rather than doing equal share of housework. got very mixed responses that challenged my entire approach to household labor division and ultimatum strategy. Several women said Ryan's solution of hiring a maid was a reasonable compromise. I should have accepted and appreciated it. One commented, "Your husband works 60 hours plus commute and offered to pay for cleaning. That's not weaponized incompetence." Another commented, "You withheld intimacy for 3 months over housework when he was trying his best with a brutal schedule." But others defended me, saying Ryan's refusal to do equal housework showed he didn't respect me as an equal partner. One said, hiring a maid instead of doing work himself proves he never intended to be an equal partner in marriage. Another said, "You were right to enforce boundaries. His leaving shows he wanted a servant, not a wife. Willing to set standards." This division made me question whether I'd been reasonable or whether my expectations had been unrealistic for our situation. Talked to the therapist about impending divorce and what had led to Ryan filing papers while hiring maid service. She asked me to describe what equal partnership in household labor had meant to me and why an exact 50/50 split was necessary. I explained that I needed Ryan to do half of the household tasks to feel like an equal partner rather than household manager. She asked if equal partnership had to mean exact equal task completion or if there were other ways to contribute equally. I said physical task completion mattered because the emotional labor of managing a household fell to women in partnerships. She asked if Ryan's 6 zero-hour work week plus 2-hour daily commute affected his available time for household tasks. I was quiet because I dismissed that factor as irrelevant to household labor division needing to be equal. She said, "It sounds like you defined equality as identical task completion without considering different time and energy availability. That Ryan had worked 60 hours in the office while you'd worked from home with a flexible schedule and no commute. But you'd expect the exact same household task completion from him as from yourself, despite major schedule differences." This was a painful realization that I'd applied ideological standards without considering the actual context of our different situations. Started thinking about 3 months of withholding intimacy and how Ryan must have experienced my ultimatum. He'd been exhausted from 6 zero-hour weeks and 2-hour commute trying to do household tasks I'd assigned to his column. I'd criticized him for not completing all tasks, rather than acknowledging he was trying despite being physically exhausted. Then I withheld intimacy for 3 months because his effort wasn't meeting the exact 50/50 standard I decided was the only option. Called Ryan a few days after divorce paper conversation hoping to discuss what therapist had helped me realize. He said he was willing to talk, but he was firm in decision to proceed with divorce, even if I'd change perspective. I said, "I realized I hadn't considered your work schedule and commute when dividing tasks exactly 50/50 on a spreadsheet." He said, "Yes. You treated 60 hours at the office like it was equivalent to your flexible work-from-home schedule. I'd been willing to pay for maid service months ago. But you'd said that was weaponized incompetence, avoiding work. When really it was me recognizing I didn't have capacity to do half of housework with my schedule and offering a solution. You'd rejected that solution and withheld intimacy for 3 months instead of compromising on what equality could mean," said through tears. I'd been wrong to dismiss maid service as a solution and wrong to withhold intimacy over housework. He said, "I appreciate that you understand now. But damage is done. I've spent 3 months feeling inadequate as a husband. 3 months of coming home exhausted and being told my exhaustion was laziness and weaponized incompetence. 3 months of trying to do tasks and being criticized for not completing them all perfectly and on schedule. 3 months of being punished with no intimacy because I couldn't meet standards that didn't account for my actual capacity. That's not marriage I want to stay in, even if you've realized your approach was flawed after seeing consequences." Asked if withdrawing an ultimatum and accepting maid service now would change his mind about divorce proceedings, he said the problem isn't just an ultimatum. It's that you prioritized ideological purity over practical compromise in marriage. That you'd rather enforce an exact 50/50 task split than consider that financial contribution plus some tasks might be equal. And when I'd offered a compromise of hiring help with money, I earned you'd rejected it as betrayal of feminist principles. Marriage isn't sustainable when the partner values ideology over finding solutions that work for both people's actual circumstances. This conversation made clear divorce was happening regardless of whether I'd changed perspective after an ultimatum damaged marriage. Ryan moved out that weekend. Maid service starting the following Monday. Cleaning house twice weekly, as he'd arranged. Sat and clean house feeling devastated that my insistence on exact task equality had destroyed my 5-year marriage. Posted article about what happened titled, "I demanded equal housework and lost my marriage when he hired a maid instead." Detailed my spreadsheet ultimatum, his exhaustion maid service solution. I'd rejected divorce papers he'd filed, explained how I'd prioritized ideological 50/50 split over, considering practical realities of our different work schedules, and how ultimatum about intimacy had his been final straw, showing him I valued principle over compromise in marriage. Article went viral with over 400K shares and passionate responses from people relating to both perspectives' Ives in situation. Many women appreciated honest accounting of how ideological rigidity had destroyed marriage with man, trying his best. One commenter said, "I did a similar thing with my husband demanding exact equal tasks. Your article helped me see I was being unreasonable." Another said, "My husband works much longer hours than me, but I expect equal housework." Realizing that's not accounting for his schedule, men's responses validated the feeling that working long hours, then being criticized for exhaustion, felt crushing and unsustainable. One man commented, "I work 70 hours weekly, and my wife acts like my exhaustion is weaponized incompetence considering divorce too." Another commented, "My ex-wife did exactly this to me. Divorced me when I hired cleaning service because it wasn't me physically doing work." But many feminists criticized articles saying, "I betrayed women by validating idea that men's work excused household labor shirking." One blogger wrote, "Author capitulated to husband's resistance rather than holding him accountable for equal partnership." Another wrote, "Accepting maid service lets men opt out of household labor by paying, reinforcing inequality, not solving it." These criticisms felt hollow after losing marriage by refusing to accept practical compromise that would have kept us together. 6 months after Ryan filed papers, divorce was finalized. He kept paying for maid service at house until property sold. Heard through mutual friends, he seemed relieved and lighter than he'd been during final year of marriage. That he'd been chronically stressed and exhausted, trying to meet impossible standard while being told exhaustion was excuse. Started dating someone who appreciated him rather than keeping score of exact task completion equality. This news made me realize I destroyed marriage with a good man who'd been trying his best within his actual capacity. Year after divorce, started therapy intensive to understand why I'd prioritized ideological principle over practical compromise. Therapist helped me see I'd become rigid about feminist principles to the point where I couldn't adapt them to actual circumstances. That equal partnership didn't have to mean identical task completion if other factors like work hours and financial contribution differed, and that weaponizing intimacy to enforce ideology had been cruel to partner who'd been exhausted and trying to find solutions. Started writing about what I'd learned, posting articles about difference between principles and applying them inflexibly, got responses from women who related to having destroyed relationships by refusing to compromise on ideological standards. One woman said, "I divorced husband over housework, using your same reasoning. Now realize I was being unreasonably rigid." Another said, "Reading your articles helped me accept my partner's offer of a higher cleaning service instead of resenting it." 2 years after divorce, published a book about experience titled, "When Feminist Principles Destroy Real Partnerships," detailed complete story from resentment about housework to ultimatum to maid service to divorce papers to lessons learned. Included research about how ideological rigidity damaged relationships when principles were applied without considering context and framework for balancing values with practical compromise that accounted for partners' actual circumstances and capacity. Book resonated with people who'd struggled to balance principles with reality in their own relationships and marriages. One reviewer wrote, "Essential reading about the danger of prioritizing ideological purity over practical partnership with real humans." Another wrote, "The author's painful honesty about destroying marriage through rigidity helps readers avoid the same mistakes." Started doing relationship coaching, helping women distinguish between legitimate boundaries and unreasonable ideological demands. One client was withholding intimacy because the husband wouldn't do exact 50/50 housework despite working 20 hours more weekly, helped her see that equal partnership could include his longer work hours plus some housework rather than identical task completion. She accepted his offer to hire cleaning service, and their relationship recovered from the brink of divorce I'd experienced. Another client had created a detailed spreadsheet like mine, expecting exact equal division of all household tasks, worked with her on considering actual time and energy availability rather than just ideological principles about equality. She adjusted expectations, accounting for partner schedules, and their relationship improved dramatically when pressure decreased. 3 years after divorce, I reflected on everything I'd learned about ideology versus practical compromise in relationships, realized my biggest mistake had been applying feminist principles inflexibly without considering the actual context of our lives. That Ryan working 60 hours plus commute meant he genuinely had less capacity than me with a flexible work-from-home schedule. But I dismissed that reality as irrelevant to ideological requirements for exact 50/50 household task division, and hiring Maid with money he earned was a reasonable compromise I'd rejected as betrayal of principles. For years, after divorce ran into Ryan, at a mutual friend's wedding, he was there with girlfriend who seemed warm and easygoing, watched them interact during the reception. She laughed when he mentioned being exhausted from work week. He later saw him talking about something, and she was listening attentively rather than critiquing or keeping score. Noticed she seemed to appreciate him as he was, rather than measuring him against the ideological standard he needed to meet. We talked briefly during the wedding. I said she seemed wonderful, and he seemed happier than I'd seen him in years. He said she didn't keep a spreadsheet of tasks or withhold affection when he was exhausted from work. Just wanted a partnership, that they'd hired cleaning service together early on, without it being a point of conflict about who was avoiding what. She worked part-time and did more housework while he worked full-time and earned more. Both felt the arrangement was fair. I apologized again for years of making him feel inadequate for exhaustion and for refusing compromise that would have worked. He said he hoped I'd learn to value actual partnership over ideological purity in future relationships. That sometimes equal meant different contributions that balanced out rather than identical task completion regardless of capacity. This conversation reinforced how completely I destroyed marriage by refusing to adapt principles to the reality of our situation. 5 years after divorce, got engaged to a partner who worked a similar, flexible schedule, and we genuinely did share housework equally. Wasn't keeping spreadsheet or score, but naturally fell into balance division because we had similar availability and energy. Realized that equal task division worked in this relationship because circumstances were actually equal, unlike with Ryan, that I tried to force equal outcome in unequal circumstances, rather than finding balance that accounted for different capacity. Started speaking at feminist events about lessons learned from destroying marriage through ideological inflexibility. Main message was that Ryan and I could have had equal partnership through different contributions rather than identical tasks. That is, longer work hours plus financial contribution plus some housework could have equaled my shorter work hours plus more housework, but I rejected that possibility. Insisting only the exact 50/50 task split qualified as equal regardless of other factors, and withholding intimacy for 3 months to enforce ideology had been cruel punishment for him being exhausted and trying. One event attendee said she'd been planning a similar ultimatum with husband. The presentation helped her reconsider approach. Another said she divorced over a similar issue years ago and now realized she'd been unreasonably rigid about ideology. 6 years after demanding equal housework and losing marriage, when he hired Maid and served papers reflected on transformation, realized that feminist principles about equality were valuable, but needed to be applied with consideration, actual circumstances that equal partnership didn't require identical contributions if different contributions balanced to create fair overall arrangement, and that I destroyed marriage with a man who'd been trying to find practical solutions because solutions didn't match my ideology. Current reflections 7 years after withholding intimacy over housework and panicking when he hired a maid and filed divorce. Learned that ideological purity about exact equal task division can destroy partnerships with unequal work schedules and capacity. That partner working 60 hours with a commute genuinely has less availability than a partner working flexibly from home. That hiring help with money earned is a reasonable compromise, not weaponized. Incompetence, avoiding responsibility that withholding intimacy to enforce ideology is cruel. Punishment that destroys marriages, not boundary that creates equality. Most importantly, that he'd offered practical solution I'd rejected, then filed divorce because ultimatum showed incompatibility. That's what I learned from demanding equal housework and panicking when he solved problem with Maid and divorce papers from rigid ideology about identical tasks to understanding equal can mean different contributions that balance fairly, from withholding intimacy over principle to realizing that cruelty destroyed marriage with a partner trying his best. That's my complete story about destroying marriage through ideological rigidity when practical compromise would have kept us together. 7 years after divorce, continued relationship coaching, helping women distinguish between necessary boundaries and ideological rigidity. Most impactful sessions involved women recognizing themselves heading towards the same ultimatums about housework I'd given Ryan. One client was planning to withhold intimacy until the husband did exactly 50% of tasks despite him working 30 hours more weekly. After hearing my story, she realized she was repeating my mistake of ignoring different availability in pursuit of ideological purity. They hired cleaning service together, and both felt relieved to have conflict resolved through practical compromise. Another client had created a detailed spreadsheet tracking every household task and keeping score like I'd done with Ryan. Helped her understand that keeping score created resentment rather than partnership, encouraged focusing on overall balance. She stopped tracking individual tasks and started appreciating husband's contributions, including financial and emotional support. Their marriage improved dramatically when pressure of perfect task equality was replaced with focus on overall partnership balance. 8 years after divorce, published a follow-up book about sustainable feminism in relationships accounting for real circumstances. Detailed research showing couples with unequal work schedules needed flexibility and household division to maintain satisfaction. That rigid 50/50 task splits worked for couples with similar availability, but created resentment in couples with different schedules, and that multiple types of contribution, including financial, emotional, and household, could combine to create equal partnership. Book helped thousands of couples find balance that worked for their actual circumstances rather than ideological ideals. Started consulting with Chores therapists on helping clients distinguish between inequality, needing correction, and different contributions balancing fairly. Main framework was assessing total contributions across multiple dimensions rather than just counting household task completion. First, therapists implementing framework reported better outcomes with couples previously stuck in housework conflict cycles. One therapist said she'd worked with a couple for a year on housework division. Using your framework helped them find balance in weeks. Current reflection 9 years after withholding intimacy over housework and watching marriage, and when I rejected practical compromise, learned that destroying marriage through ideological rigidity taught me more than any feminist text about balancing principles with reality. That Ryan's maid service solution had been a genuine compromise. I rejected because it didn't match my ideological standards. That equal partnership requires considering actual circumstances, not just applying formulas about identical task completion. Most importantly, he'd been right to divorce me because my rigidity showed I valued ideology over finding solutions that worked. That's everything learned from 9 years of reflection on demanding equal chores and losing marriage when he offered a practical solution. From withholding intimacy to enforced principle to understanding that cruelty destroyed partnership with exhausted man, trying his best, from rejecting maid service as weaponized incompetence to realizing it was a reasonable compromise, accounting for different capacity. That's my final lesson about ideology destroying marriage, when practical compromise would have created sustainable, equal partnership. 9 years after divorce, continued teaching workshops about balancing feminist principles with practical reality in relationships. Most powerful sessions involved women recognizing they were repeating my pattern of rigid ideology, destroying good partnerships. One participant said she'd been withholding intimacy for months over exact housework division despite husband working brutal hours. After hearing the complete story about Ryan hiring a maid and divorcing me, she went home and accepted his cleaning service offer. Told me months later that accepting compromise had saved marriage she'd been about to destroy through ideological rigidity. Another participant said she'd divorced husband over a similar housework conflict years ago and deeply regretted losing him, that he'd offered practical solutions like I'd rejected Ryan. But she'd insisted only his physical labor counted. He'd remarried someone who appreciated his solutions, and they seemed genuinely happy while she remained single and regretful. 10 years after withholding intimacy and losing marriage, reflected on decades of growth from that painful experience, realized that Ryan filing divorce papers while hiring a maid had been merciful, forcing me to confront destructive rigidity that if he'd stayed, I would have continued enforcing impossible standards, destroying both of us through ideological inflexibility, started speaking at universities about applying feminist principles with wisdom rather than rigidity in real relationships. Main message was that Ryan's solution had been feminist in outcome, even if not in process. I demanded that the household being clean through hired help free both of us from conflict while respecting his capacity limits, but I rejected feminist outcome because the process didn't match ideological purity about him physically doing tasks. Current reflection 10 years after demanding equal chores and panicking when he hired a maid and served divorce papers, learned that sometimes feminist outcomes matter more than ideologically pure processes in creating actual equal partnerships. Ryan's service achieved the goal of a clean house and my freedom while respecting his exhaustion from work. That my rejection of practical compromise in favor of ideological purity destroyed marriage that could have thrived. Most importantly, 10 years later, his decision to divorce me while solving problems taught me more than staying ever could. That's my final reflection on decades of learning from demanding equal chores and losing everything when he found a practical solution